A while before, I made a video on Plato's Allegory of the Cave and how it has become an important tool for the reactionary right to make its case against the left. I pointed out a few problems with the case of the right. The reason for Allegory of the Cave being so prominent in Plato's work is that it is not inherently political, but it is inherently metaphysical. Plato wrote a lot about politics. His book, The Republic, is perhaps a great intro into the political nature of the reality itself and how civilizations evolve over time. However, while The Republic is considered as a great piece of work, Plato's Allegory of the Cave enjoys a greater place in his works because it is more universal. Instead of referring to political concepts, Allegory of the Cave is referring most probably to ontological truths and their relations with the way we acquire knowledge. Plato's idea of forms shows a very similar striking as many concepts propagated by idealists. While Plato's idea of forms uses the term forms, which is used also by Aristotle and then Aquinas, Plato's forms are different than those used by Aristotle and Aquinas in the very sense that Plato's forms are not only superior to the material world, but they are distinct from the material world and exist in themselves, which is not the case exactly in both the doctrines of Aristotle or Aquinas. Though a case can be made that Aquinas' views ultimately converge to Plato's views if analyzed carefully. The reason for the superior existence of forms which Plato ascribes is because of his view of essentialism. Essentialism, when looked from a certain perspective, grants a superior status to forms because the material world is corruptible and, as such, always falls short of essentialist requirement which is needed to ground reality in the set of attributes of a being, which then would be referred to as God. So, linking the Plato's idea of forms, which translates into Plato's allegory of the cave, to something material like politics, questions the validity of the analysis. But this analysis is not just present on the right. A lot of time, a lot of people on all sides of the political spectrum believe that to be true, believe that there is some shadowy group hiding in a distance which is making people believe in certain things though they are not true. This is also something that feminism believes in. Feminists believe that there is a sort of shadow people working in the background, reinstating patriarchy and developing the ideals of patriarchy and seeding them in individual minds through propaganda, through the use of art, and through the use of writing, which they have to counter by their own propaganda. Because of the inherent bias and putting the blame on some shadowy group that is present in our own psyche, we observe the other side doing it, regardless of the facts of which side is doing what. Now, it could be said, irrespective of of this analysis, that there is a certain group which may be running a shadowy government or a shadowy complex of people, which are indeed planting ideas into the minds of the people. But Plato's allegory of the cave is not about that. The puppeteers in the allegory of the cave are not necessarily presented negatively, but they are presented as being put in that role by necessity. There's a great difference between the two statements because the second statement links essentialism to ontological reality as Plato envisioned it, and forms the grounding of the oncoming thesis of idealism. A lot of political philosophies come from how do you view, come from the fact of how do you view metaphysics of the world to be. Dualists will have generally a different philosophy than materialists, who will have generally a different philosophy than idealists. A lot of time, a lot of people adopt a political outlook of consequentialism. Consequentialism uh, is a doctrine of morality essentially, but also of politics uh, retroactively. It is based on the idea that the political decisions or moral decisions are weighed on the basis of the consequences they yield to. The consequences they yield. As such, a decision that may be right in a certain circumstance may be wrong in the other circumstance. The problem with consequentialism is not that it is wrong. It may be wrong, but the bigger problem with consequentialism is that consequentialism does not intellectually convince people, so they need to craft principles. But principles, by their very nature and definition, are unchangeable in many situations. The whole point of crafting a principle is that if the situation changes, even then people have something to base their decisions on, in which case the principle must stand intact and must be at least somewhat rigid to withstand the pressure of passing of time. Otherwise, there will be no order and there will be no cohesion as the ideas quickly change from one day to another, from 1 minute even to another. This is the reason why consequentialism ultimately leads to societal collapse. The reason for that is because the consequentialists have to adopt a principles based standard, which, however, is not applicable in their own way vision of how morality operates. But a standard based on principles also, just based on principles, also does not stand because even if a society is created in which there are rigid standards and principles, they would be violated consequentially because people react to consequences more than they react to principles. If there is some principle that yields negative effects to people, first they will try to violate that in secret and then they will try to gain acceptance and try to violate it in public. Afterwards, the standard itself would fail and would be removed from the minds of the people by planting a new standard which would be against the previous standard. This is how the right left dichotomy operates, wherein the order set up by the right is replaced by the left with the help of liberals. But the liberals and the left do not remove the hierarchy, but they only change it to create a new one. As such, what we know is that while the consequentialists may be in all good faith try to overturn some principles, they will establish new principles in return, which would be overturned by another generation of consequentialists. The problem with all of that is it goes against the Plato's idea of forms. When the right looks at these things and tries to insert consequentialism into there to argue for a particular case, it fails to understand that if an ideal was already established in the minds of the people, it should never go away, because an ideal, by very definition, is the ideal. If you view something as an ideal, you already view it as something of a high status in your mind, something that takes precedence over most of the other things. An ideal is only cut by the ideal, maybe not in action, because in action people can adopt all different standards and all different modes of doing a thing, but at least in the way an argument is presented. A person who is changing this principle from one argument to another is something more than a hypocrite, because a hypocrite may be a person who is getting lured by a false sense of positive benefit into doing something that he is against. But the person who is changing principles from one day to another is either being quite naive and ignorant so as to not realize this, or is engaged in deception, which is far worse than hypocrisy. As such, in view of this fact, it has to be recognized that if there is an ideal already in the minds of the people, it should never go away. So you will have to never, and by never I mean really never, have to bring that ideal in public right as a question of to be put for discussion, because people instinctively are biased towards the idea. If, for example, there is an idea that honesty is the best policy, even among the group of thousands of dishonest people, you would find that they would agree that honesty is the best policy because they cannot deny it. Even the thieves have an internal conduct of honesty because they know that honesty has a value. As such, if there is an opinion that is being brought into the public discourse or political discourse, it must be consequentialist. It must not be an ideal opinion, opinion on the idea. This brings back another important question. So, what is the ideal in minds of the people? Well, the answer to that question is immediately uh, formed when, in the minds of the people, when people ask themselves a simple question. If the ideal should remain consistent, but even then the political discourse exists, then the only way that the ideal is not forming the part of the political discourse which is changing is if the ideal is hidden by the extensive consequentialist uh, habits of the people. As such, the ideal must be of the nature that is never brought into the public discourse at the mainstream level, because if it is brought into the public discourse at the mainstream level, it should ideally never go away. If an ideal is established, for example, in the public discourse, there will be no way to undercut it. The only way to undercut it is if there is no mainstream uh, grounding of the ideal in the public discourse at any point in the time. Because once the ideal is grounded, then there is no way to remove that ideal, because it is instinctively in the minds of the people as a great ideal, as a great thing to follow, and would be granted precedence in minds of people over any consequentialist claims they raise against this idea. So the only way, and I will repeat this again, for the ideal to not be uh, consistent in the public discourse is if it is never brought to the mainstream discourse in the first place, which means that every mainstream opinion that is present in the society or every mainstream belief is unprincipled. And this is the reason why forms are important. Plato believed that the world of the shadows that we see is not just corruptible, but it is faulty in and of itself, and thus can never be perfected. The reason why it cannot be perfected is because the true knowledge is never brought out into the cave. What can only be done is that the people of the cave be told that there is light outside, and then a person can lead any other person who voluntarily wants to leave the cave to leave the cave. But the people who are leaving the cave must always be in minority. They cannot be in majority, because if they are in majority, then they can transform the cave into the cave that represents the truth. The whole idea of presenting allegory of the cave is to bring light to the fact that people are resistant to truth. And because people are resistant to truth, any claims of people instinctively realizing the ideal of, let's say, inherent European civilization on the right, or any such ideal on the left, like equality, this thesis must be false. If you are trying to tie up with the allegory of the cave, because Plato there is saying that most of the people who are present in the cave are in the error. The only way to get out of the cave is to exit the cave. So the only way to realize the truth is to go into the world where the knowledge is there. which is a perfect world, which is the world of forms. But the only way to do that is to leave the material world. And once you have left the material world, you are, in all sense, practical sense, dead. The whole point of this is now to connect this to a succeeding idea which is presented in the Bible. In the Bible, the world that humans inhabit is presented as flawed by its very nature. Because the world is flawed by its very nature, the only way that truth can prevail in this world is when you move out of this world. Truth is not present in this world, and it cannot be created in this world in complete essence. It can only be created in the world of forms, which are pure. The world itself is impure, it is mixed, it is shadowy, it is a fictitious representation, which is a little bit related to the object, but not a complete and accurate description of the object. The form is the complete and accurate description of the object that actually exists. As such, all the inherent thoughts that people have that are instinctive, that are prominent, that are mainstream, must be in some or the other way only a shadow of the true nature of the reality. Because if it was possible for us to know the true nature of reality at any particular time, there would be no reason for us to leave that truth and adopt a falsehood, because that would be both against the reality and our natural instincts. So, in Plato's allegory of the cave, the important point to realize, which Plato makes, is that the only way where the only place where the truth would be found would be on the fringe that would always remain the fringe. Because the moment another person believes that he has the truth, that he is actually seeing the shadows while being present in the world, while uh, siding with the mainstream opinion that he is not seeing the shadows but actual objects, he should be in the wrong. He should be in the similar state as the prisoners who are thinking that they are seeing the actual objects but are instead seeing the shadows. There is nothing to distinguish the right wing prisoner from the left wing prisoner in this regard, because both believe that they are right. The only way to distinguish them is to ask which of the person has come out of the cave, because only the person who has come out of the cave knows the real reality. But the person who has come out of the cave would himself not be concerned with the consequences present in the world, the effects of things happening in the world, and as such, the political discourse would not even begin to start in his mind. If the political discourse itself does not begin to start in his mind, obviously it won't reach an end, which means that the political truth can never reach the level of metaphysical truth, because it is concerned with the material world, and as such is faulty in and of itself. The reason for this analysis of the argument is because Plato's allegory of the cave is perhaps the strongest indicator of an idealistic world, of an essentialist world, of a world based on forms, and as such, its ideals, the ideals that it represents, need to be protected and need to be preserved, because it is the only hope that allows people to see through the deceptive nature of reality and look at the underlying uh, world of forms, which is way different than the shadowy world we live in, and forms the first step towards spirituality. Because if the world of the objects was in some ways salvageable, then spirituality would be redundant. Only when the world of material objects is unsalvageable, spirituality becomes important, because it talks of the another world of spirits that is not yet seen and is taken on faith, but it's still more attractive to the world that offers nothing but hopelessness and a sense of loss.